Good afternoon, everybody. I think we can slowly start. This panel is sponsored by the Czech Producers Association, so it obviously will be about the role of independent producers in the current media industry landscape with the boom of streamers and serial scripted content production. We have three guests. Piodor Gustafsson, whom you already know from one of the previous panels, from TV4 and C More, who in his career gained experience both as TV executive, independent producer, even literary agent, as I learned, if that's right. So he can speak of the two sides of the collaboration between broadcasters and independent producers, and what is the role of independent producers in the current situation and maybe in the near future. The other two guests are representatives of the Czech Producer Association, both running independent production companies. Vratislav Šlajer is a CEO of Bionaut. Bionaut is producing for both public service television and commercial television in the Czech Republic. And Filip Bobiňski is a CEO of Dramedy Productions, who also produced a number of TV series for Czech broadcasters. In the first part, we'll talk about the Nordic situation. So I will first ask several questions to Piodor, and then we will move to comparing the Nordic situation with the East Central Europe and Czech Republic more specifically. So Piodor, if we can start with a simple question. What is the current situation in terms of in-house versus independent producers, in-house production versus projects developed and produced by independent producers in the Nordic countries? We know that many famous series, and Dusan Mulicek mentioned it actually in one of the previous panels, which are known as so-called Netflix originals or HBO originals, were in fact produced by and developed by independent producers, but the branding works differently. We usually don't know about them so well. So what is the situation in TV4 and Sweden more generally?
The Nordic is 5 countries, so it's slightly different between the countries. But in Sweden, I would say 100% of all scripted productions are carried out by independent production companies. And then you have, of course, these bigger production companies that are in bigger group of companies like Benny J and so forth, but they are not owned by TV stations or platforms. But in the other countries, especially Denmark, DR are still occasionally doing in-house drama. But I would say for the rest, it's almost 100% independent production companies producing the series.
So before becoming the director of scripted content at TV4, you worked for SVT, the public service broadcaster in Sweden. And I learned that actually before you came, the situation was different. So there was in-house production at SVT, and you changed it. Can you speak a little bit about the reasons why you did that and the effects it had on SVT?
Sure. I would say there's 2 major things that happened within the public broadcaster. One was before I joined, and one was when I joined. Around 2005, the management of SVT decided that they had to cut costs dramatically because it's state-funded, and in those days it was license fees. Nowadays it's tax money, and so they could see they couldn't afford to increase the quality on the programming, and that was all programming, because the overhead was too big. And so 2005 they took this dramatic decision to cut the staff with half. So they went from 4,000 to 2,000, and it took 3 years to carry that through. And it was a sort of a very tough thing for the CEO at the time, but she got the staff and the unions and everyone to support it, because that was the only way to increase the quality. And so it took 3 years to sort of rearrange the whole company, and also meant that sort of smaller studios all around the country had to be closed down, and they had gigantic studios in Malmö and Gothenburg that also were closed, and they built smaller studios. So the only in-house production that continued was sort of the news and current affairs and some talk shows, but all the drama productions were decided to be moved out to production companies. With one exception, there was still a full drama team in Stockholm that sort of had, basically they could 100% produce scripted. But when I started 2009 and they wanted me to improve the quality, I said the only way for me to guarantee better quality is if I have flexibility. If I know there is a full drama team standing there, 1st of January, waiting for a project to produce, they will cost money whether I have a project for them or not. So I said, well, my condition to take this job is that you also let go of those people. And of course, that's a tough thing to decide, but they were hired immediately when they left anyway, so they were hired by the producers, so there was no real risk. But from that point on, we could focus on developing projects with independent producers, and when they were ready to be greenlit, we commissioned it, which meant that sort of gaining flexibility increased the quality. And one of the absolute first shows that I commissioned was The Bridge. So, I was proven right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there were probably many unhappy people as well from inside a SVT, I can imagine.
Yes, but at the same time, when a company is stagnating and people are not feeling good either, because they are not fully, they don't feel empowered and happy about the future anyway. So I think that created a very good atmosphere of and feeling that we have now much more money to actually make good things. And that created a good sort of spirit in the company. Because, it's unlikely that any public broadcaster will be given more and more money every year. Yeah. So the budget is basically the same, so you have to cut costs.
So can you describe a typical arrangement of this collaboration, a commissioning editor on one side, independent producer on the other? How does it start and evolve in the lifetime of a project?
Well, I can only talk how it is TV4, because that's where I'm now. I'm sure that Anna Kroneman has changed things since I was there. But in principle, we have sort of we have an intake system. So we regularly go out and talk to producers, either in forums like this or individually. We meet, I would say, the 40 biggest independent producers. We meet them once a year, and during COVID, we did it digitally. And we basically tell them what our vision for the next 2-3 years, and then we give them our sort of email address, which is called serier@tv4.se. And they send an email, and they get a link, and they can upload the project. And then we sort of have a team who look at everything that comes in. And then we have a rule, which is an internal rule, that if we meet every Monday and discuss everything that came in. And what we usually do is that if we feel that either the team behind it or the sort of the idea is nothing for us, we just write an email saying that, sorry, this is not for us at the moment, so no, thank you. So in general, if there is a no, they get a reply within 2 weeks. If it's a maybe, we reply within 4 weeks or 3-4 weeks, and then we meet them and they can pitch the project. And if we after that think that it can go all the way, we then spend development money to develop it to a stage where we can greenlit our part of the financing. And all the high quality dramas, none of the high quality dramas we can fully finance. So once we've made the decision to come in with our part of the financing, we then collaborate with the production companies to find the rest of the financing. And some producers are really sort of good at that on their own, so we don't have to interfere in that or assist them in that. But some producers don't have that experience, so then we assist them in it. So we regularly talk to French broadcasters, Italian broadcasters, German broadcasters, and hopefully in the future, Czech and Slovak and other broadcasters. We have this really great series. Would you be interested to look at it? And then we introduce the production company and the producer, and they can continue the conversation. And for example, with the German broadcaster, we have basically monthly meetings where we go through our development slate, and then it's, that looks interesting, and that looks interesting. And once we are happy with the development, we let the producers take over the conversations.
So what kind of feedback do you give the independent producers throughout the process? How specific are you about the expectations you have as a broadcaster, as a commissioner in individual steps of this process? Or do you leave it to them to develop the first set of scripts? Or
I think the most, when you're in an organization where you're commissioning things, I think the most difficult thing is to select the right projects. Because sometimes a project comes in, a pitch is brilliant, but then when you start to look sort of under the surface, there's a lot of insecurities. Maybe there are not experienced writers, or the producer is not experienced. And I like to sort of ask those questions very, very early, because at the end of the day, we have to decide how much energy we should put into the development. Because my philosophy is that if we have a system where we work with independent producers, they have to do the job. We will tell them what we need. And that's why it's so important that from day one to what we say, hook arms. So if you come with an idea and we say, that's really nice, but do this instead, then it's our responsibility to make it work. But if we say that, yeah, we really like it, let's hook arm and decide what we need to do in order to make it perfect. And then the development process works really well. But if you want something else with it, maybe it's like, the writer is fantastic, but the idea, we don't like the idea. Then we say yes, because the writer is good, and then we try to push them to do something else. It's never going to be a good series anyway. So we rather say no if it's not right for us, and then focus on the things that feels right. And when I started, part of my team were more used to act as script editors. So the last 2 years, I've been trying to train them to work as commissioners. Because even though sort of at the end of the day, the people that works for me have a boss, that's me, but I also have a boss. So, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the things that we want to make also is approved by the board of directors. So it's our responsibility to make sure that the team that are developing it get the right feedback so that it's good enough for the board of directors to say yes.
So maybe we could move slowly to comparative discussion, and I would like to ask Filip and Vratislav, do you feel that you know what is needed from the broadcasters, either commercial or public service, when you develop and produce projects for them? Do you have this feeling, as Piodor just said, that you exactly know what they need and want from you?
Can I maybe try to say something more in general first? The feeling is that we in Czechoslovakia and then Czech Republic, all the studios and TVs were state-owned until 89, 90. So we have about like 30 years of sort of independent, sort of privately run audiovisual industry. And I think it's fairly new, actually. It's being sort of independent, either commercial driven or sort of new setup for public broadcaster. It's fairly new. And I would say there's like been like 3 generations of producers since then. I think we're like the second one, I would say. The first one was more about film because the TV was not the thing. I think me and Filip became sort of the first young independent producers doing TV. Now there is already a new generation of younger producers, and you can see sort of a big development on side of independent producers, the experience, and we tend to sort of, you have to look at it that we have to sort of build the whole industry anew and get experience, and it takes time. And I think the same thing is, has to be said about broadcasters. We all sort of needed to learn new experience and the craft, to be responsible for what we do, and also learn to communicate. And now, sort of answer your question, that I still think that there is a process in a way how independent producers and broadcasters communicate with each other, how feedback is set up, how broadcasters ask for what they want, and it's improving really fast. And I think it's getting better and it's more clearer, and we all get experience, but it's generally sort of growing together. And I think when you talk about like how you accept projects, and maybe later we'll talk also about the feedback that we discussed before, how you give to the producers. I think that's something that we have to learn. And I would say that we're still not there on both sides. Sort of to understand for independent producers what broadcasters want, and broadcasters have to be more clear what they want. And that's where you sort of build trust. So how Filip sees it, but
well,
it's a continuing process, sort of building this partnership and trust. It takes time.
It's a process indeed, but my feeling is that was why I wanted to be a producer. I wanted to develop my content. And I think that's, and we have to say it, and we can repeat it still, especially in our countries. Producing is not about being on a set and running the production itself. Producing is about being an investor in the content, in the talent which you work with, in the people you hire to write scripts and develop topics, develop projects, and then be able to run it. And actually, as a producer, you have to be creatively controlling the project over the whole process of the production, that you really deliver what you said on the beginning you want to do. And you also said it to your partners. So there is a big part of the trust from the broadcaster, and they trust you to the producer. You are the responsible for what you are going to deliver. So you really have to be, you really have to create, to control creatively. And just to go back a little bit to your question, I think we, in Dramedy, or in my team, we always try to guess what the broadcasters would like to, and we also think about what the viewers would like to see. And sometimes it's, or somehow it's matching in the end of the day. I mean, it's like finding the common language with the broadcaster, finding the topic. It's it's an experience. Sometimes it's working with maybe with data and looking at the market. It's so I would say like somehow we know what the broadcaster wants, but it's always, we don't have to always fit into what they actually expect. So maybe some project has to be produced later, or we have to have some other one.
But I also realize that there's a lot of similarities between Czech Republic and Sweden. I believe there's like 10 million people living here, same in Sweden. Until 1984, I think, we only had public broadcaster. And there was very few production companies, very few means to finance your films and TV series. So 1984, the market was totally underdeveloped. So the independent producers have actually developed from that point, and it took quite a long time before anyone else than SVT actually commissioned scripted TV series. So it's been a sort of a process there as well. But I think one of the sort of important reasons why we may be a little bit ahead is because we've had this competitive situation. Because if the Danes did a good TV series, you know, we couldn't be worse, so we had to make better than they did. But we also collaborated because Danes and Norwegians could see Swedish TV and the other way around. So we knew exactly what they were doing. So if they did anything good, a feature film or TV series, we of course wanted to be better. So it's been like that back and forth. And then after a while, you know, we saw a really good Danish actor. So why not take him in a Swedish show? Obviously he speaks Danish, but you know, that could work if you're creative enough. So collaborating over the borders and co-producing has sort of developed us, and also the competitive situation has developed us. And that's why I think it's so good for us as commissioning editors or as a TV station to have a lot of producers and production companies, because then you have to compete to be commissioned from us. So, I mean, I have a fantastic development team. 2 of them are writers even. You met Dunja today. I mean, we could develop in-house for sure. But how could I know that that's the best idea? I can only do that if I get, you know, let's say we get, in average, I would say we get 5-6 proposals every week from different production companies. Most of them, you know, have, you know, developed at least the first step, and I would say at least 50% looks quite interesting. But then we started, you know, talk about if it's the right genre, you know, things like that. Would it actually be possible to develop it all the way? But I mean, just from a practical point of view, we could develop everything in-house. I have like 3 producers working as executive producers. I mean, they know how to produce. But would it be the best programs? I don't think so.
I think there's an important point on which also relates to the fact that what you said would happen in SVT, that you have basically lowered number of employees and you gave the money into the market. This is very important, somehow the stability of demand. And this is something what has been developing recently in the Czech Republic. Of course, nowadays it's much better for the producers because there is a demand now with Voyo entering the market, and commercial broadcasters, actually Nova especially this year, starting to work more and more with independent producers. This is very important because then there is a chance for the people for the producers to exactly dedicate their time, their efforts, and their money, their finance to develop the projects and prepare them for the market for this proposal. Because in the past, as Vratja says, it was coming from the old times of the one broadcaster, and they were used to produce everything in-house. So there was no demand. We had to fight somehow, like convince the market, convince the broadcasters in the past 15, 20 years that it actually makes sense to work with independent producers. So, but this is changing, and it's a very positive trend now. So.
And since I've been a producer, I think it's really nice now that I can sleep at night. I don't have to work all weekends. You know, it's pretty nice to, you know, let the producers and production companies take all the tough parts.
So you said you trained your team of commissioning editors. Actually, twice, maybe you built a team for development and commissioning in both SVT and TV4. What do you say are key features of a good commissioning editor? What she or he does need to know and do?
I think the most important thing is to inspire the creative teams in the companies. I presume you usually work with freelancers anyway. I mean, the writers and directors. I mean, once they come with the idea and you hook arm, I think my team should inspire them and, you know, put them in the right direction. Because as a producer, I know that you develop something and you really think that the stuff that you deliver to the TV station, it's now brilliant, you know. And then, you know, they read it and you meet them and say, but how about this thing? It's like, I didn't think about that. So it's a very rewarding process, in my opinion. And as a producer and also the creative team, they need that, and we all need that balance, because you get blind when you work with something every day for a long time, and then you need someone to come in and say, but how about that? You know, and that's how I think we should work. I don't like when we come into a meeting and we start saying that, okay, page 3, remove that line, or page 4, have another turning point, you know, page 22. And, you know, those detailed comments doesn't really help, because we should look at it as, okay, we decide when the script is ready to be produced, and that's our job, to fit our, you know, platform or TV station or whatever. That's our decision, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, it's my ass. So that's the only thing I'm interested in, to make sure that the scripts works for us, that the casting works for us. And that's different between public broadcaster and private broadcaster, because we need some stars in our shows, because people are paying to see our SVOD, or if it's the ad-driven linear and the AVOD, we have advertisers who are paying to have programs that have stars. So, you know, it's slightly different. But I want good stars. But we also have to admit there are good producers and there are bad producers. And, you know, and you have to be able to admit that. And it's also something that we as commissioners have to sort of find out. And sometimes there are people I've never worked with, or I don't know them enough. And then if they have a good product and everything feels good, it's nice to take a couple of development steps to see how they act, how they talk, how they treat their creators and stuff like that. So, you know, you also have to educate producers and creators so that they do a good job for us.
I think also it's important when you said that when you get a pitch, you sort of have to accept it, not really, you know, ask for something else. But also our role is to, when we pitch and someone says like, yes, but we want something different, we have to say no. We have to sort of be, because there is bad and good producers, but also there is a good producer who sort of gets pushed into by himself, by, you know, the need to make money, pushed into doing something that he has no experience with or not real talent for.
I hate producers who says, okay, so what do you want? I said, well, you know, you coming to me with something, you should know what you want. I can only say if we want it or not. And you know, we are in a luxury situation because we get, you know, 5-6 pitches every week. We don't have to, you know, try to make something out of something that isn't there. So we pick the ones that we like the best, and then we develop them. And I would say approximately 60% that we develop more than the first step is actually then made.
What is the first step for you?
Usually, it depends what they've developed on their own already. Now, for example, when HBO closed down, we got a lot of really well-developed projects. So, you know, then the first step is more to, you know, make it work a little bit better for us. But normally, if it's a sort of an independent production company that is not owned by Bunny J, then we expect them to come with something that makes the idea clear, how it works as a TV series. It hasn't anything to do with the amount of papers. It's more about how clear the idea is. And then the first step is usually a story outline and a pilot script. that's sort of, I would say, 80% of the.
That's what you normally do in Dramedy, that we try to do this, so, because it's also that it's kind of like answer to what Vratja said about protecting what you want to do. Because if you are able to define it, to do the pilot script and all the thing around it, you have really a product which you can defend.
Yeah.
So then it's something we can talk about.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes when it comes, I mean, let's say that we have 10 outstanding creators in Sweden. And if they come with a project to us, we may take the first step with them because they say, well, you know, I want to, you know, develop this on my own until I know what it is. And of course, also development means that you can't know everything when you do the first step. It's also finding out what it actually is. So you also have to accept that certain things cannot be ready when you start developing things. So there is, you know, must be some flexibility in it. But when we then take in those guys, women or men that are sort of capable of developing it without a producer or a director involved, then, you know, we can take a couple of steps with them. Maybe we do 3 scripts and a story outline or a storyline. But our experience is that it's very difficult then to find a good producer for that project. Because as a producer, you want to be in on it from the beginning. And at least in Sweden, there's very few service producers. And, you know, if you're, you know, working 24/7 for 8 months, you want to feel that it's yours as well. And I think that's sort of, as a producer, I would never produce something that I didn't, you know, have a passion for.
So could you summarize what are the typical mistakes independent producers do while pitching projects to you or aspiring to collaborate with you?
I think the most important thing for anyone who's pitching something is that the decision to make this film or this TV series is mine. Even though I can go to Voyo first and say, look, I mean, we come to you first because we think it's a perfect home for this series. But if you are not willing to take the series, we'll go to someone else. That gives you sort of that proves to the commissioner that you're passionate about the project. You want to make this project whatever happens. And that's a very good feeling for a commissioner to know that, okay, you know, these guys really have thought about this. They really want to make this. That gives you a lot of strength.
When we look at the Nordic region, we actually are envious seeing how developed the market is as a multinational whole. Among individual Nordic regions, the level of sharing, collaboration, but also the structure of the industry with the European conglomerates operating in the Nordic region, like Banijay or Viaplay or Seymour. We don't have this kind of companies here yet who would step in between the broadcasters and independent producers and help them finance or develop projects. But the collaboration started probably in the 60s with the Nordic Vision project. So it takes time. But if you would look from your perspective at East Central Europe, let's say the Visegrad countries, which have some common history and cultural similarities, what would you say are the necessary steps to bring these markets and industries closer together?
I think the first step is usually that you find. I always think there has to be a delegate producer, someone who has the main responsibility. But even though it's at first a little bit complicated or even more expensive to co-produce with someone in another country, you're cross-fertilizing each other because even though there are a lot of similarities, there are other ideas that you could be sort of inspired by. So just by talking to someone who is used to produce in another country will develop you as a producer. And you have to sort of think about things. And And if they say, well, you know, for this to work in Slovakia, we need to do this. And then say, oh, okay, maybe we could, you know, fix it this time. But if it also works in Slovakia, it probably also works somewhere else. So the more you collaborate and co-produce, the more you cross-fertilize each other. And even though I always believe that, you know, the main creator should sort of use the local DNA to make the show unique, it doesn't mean that you cannot communicate with others and be inspired by others. And the more people you can communicate an idea with, the easier it is for it to travel. And once it starts to travel, you have the possibility to co-produce with countries also outside your immediate territory. I worked with animation a long time ago, and in animation in Europe, that's what you do, you co-produce. And it's slightly easier because in animation you do the sort of voices afterwards. Usually you animate with English and then you can put any voice in it. But animation producers are, you know, they are world-class co-producers. And the great thing with what I learned then is that you have to be totally transparent. I've experienced in non-animation that some production companies, some producers, they're co-producing just to get enough funding from co-production funds and take their share of that, and then they basically don't participate. But I think, you know, to find real collaborators that you actually work together with, and you take a sort of a joint responsibility for the creative process, even though I think the delegate producer have to make the final decisions. I think that starts to sort of, it develops the market, it develops the producers. But I think your question was actually slightly different. I think the first step in the Nordics was that we were allowing Danish directors to direct Swedish films and TV series. And then they brought some Danish actors and vice versa. It's more common that the Danes work in the other countries than us working in Denmark. But you know, setting that aside, it's been a very good process, because then, you know, gradually the Danish actors become more and more known in Sweden and vice versa. And then the Danish director who worked in Sweden then is next time doing a Danish film or TV series, met some really nice Swedish actors that they want to bring into their Danish film. So for Susanne Bier, I think you all know who it is. I mean, she did her first 2 films in Sweden. And then when she started working in Denmark, she brought a lot of Swedish actors there. And the funny thing nowadays is that the Danes think that the Swedish actors are brilliant, and the Danish actors are not so good. But you know, in Sweden it's the other way around. We think the Danish actors are brilliant, and the Swedish are, you know, not so good.
This is happening here as well, but I would say mostly with Slovak actors or rather actresses. Why do you think that we don't have more co-productions with Poland, for example, in TV series?
I think that the important thing is that we don't really have much acquisitions, or we didn't have. You know, well, it's strangely not many Polish series on Czech TVs, even Slovak series, and these markets are really separate, even though there is some common audience sense. But I think it's changing with platforms, especially on Netflix and HBO. You can get lots of Polish TV series, and they're successful. You know, big part of top 10 on a Czech and Slovak Netflix is Polish series. So you can see that there is demand. There is, you know, we can actually cross between the countries, but it wasn't happening. It's probably systematic. I don't know. I don't have answer for that. Why there wasn't more acquisitions, sort of to connect the markets through the audience. You know, what works in Poland, what works in Czech Republic, finding the common connections. There obviously are lots of, you know, film Czech-Slovak productions. There is some co-production in TV, but not many of them really successful in both countries. Meaning that either it's like a minority co-production from one of the countries, the Slovakia or Czech Republic, and then it's sort of also a minor success in the country. There's few exceptions, but it's I don't know, maybe it needs more sort of ambitions on the side of, you know, independent producers and broadcasters to find the common market and connect them. Rather, I think the feeling is that for example, you know, Czech and Slovak markets are more and more separated in what the audience expects. But still, there has to be a connecting space somewhere, you know, that would sort of appeal to both markets.
Key factor in the Nordic territory is that we have something called the Nordic Film and TV Fund, which is a sort of a joint fund which the TV channels in all countries and the cultural the Minister of Cultures are paying to that fund, and then as an independent body that sort of decides which series and film get money. It's not a lot of money. I think it's maximum 300,000 euros, but for an independent producer that could make a difference. And you have to have a co-production in order to get the money.
I think
and then also, which is my point actually, and also you have to have commitments from at least 3 different countries that are committed to actually publish it, or air it, or broadcast it. Or.
I think here it was more like the reason that we didn't have enough developed and prepared interesting topics which would really work among more territories. It's not so easy, basically. No. And it's actually about the maturity of the market and maturity of the producers, maturity of the creators. And so we are getting there, probably, step by step. It's always easier to do a series which is successful in your local market, which is very local and your local market. But this is not going to work for co-production. For co-production, you need really an event, something which is bigger, which can really talk in more territories. And for this, you need experience, money, established producers, and then probably you can bring projects which can convince both both broadcasters in different countries, because I think otherwise it's for them it's also a big risk, because normally the co-productions, as Vratislav said, they didn't have so much success because they, or at least maybe only in one country, yes, and not in the other one, because they were not really attractive enough for the other country.
But there you also have an opportunity as a producer association, is to start to talk with the other countries' producer association to see how you can help each other to develop production companies and producers in all countries. Because I think the biggest sort of change in Sweden at least came when SVT had the courage to broadcast Danish TV series primetime in the Swedish drama slot. And in the beginning it took some courage, but at the same time it needed to be on a certain quality level. But you know, when we and also when I came 2009, I wanted more flexibility than removing the in-house production team. I also wanted to be flexible on when we published the Swedish series. Because normally it was published the first week of January. We had a sort of 8 o'clock Sunday slot and an 8 o'clock Monday slot, which was a drama. And it was always early in the season or late in the season where the expensive drama series were published. But, you know, if I wanted to edit another 4 weeks, it was 4 weeks delayed. And there was nothing then to put there. And I said, why don't we put the Danish stuff there? And I was like, no, we can't put the Danish stuff. It's not going to work. Because usually that was like 10 o'clock. But then we put The Killing there. And it was like, it worked. And then that was sort of a bit problematic because it worked almost as good as the Swedish stuff. So we only paid, you know, a tenth for The Killing. Why should we produce, you know... But that also creates a competitive situation.
So we know the first step for the East European vision, or for imitating the Nordic situation here. But our time is slowly running out, so I would like to ask the audience whether you have any questions or points about the differences and similarities between the regions, or about producers what they do right and wrong.
I have a question.
Yes.
Discuss on that if it's now normal that you broadcast the Danish series and the Danish broadcast Swedish, it's like you don't think now?
If it's common, I would say that it's more common that Swedish platforms and broadcasters have Norwegian and Danish than the other way around. It's Norway has always aired a lot of Swedish stuff. It's been less common in Denmark, but DR are doing a lot of, I mean, even TV4 stuff, which usually would go on TV2, is normally going to DR. So yes, it's quite common. And a couple of our absolute biggest successes on C More are Danish series.
Any more? Yeah.
What do you do if the script is not good enough for you?
And then we say no, or we keep developing it. Or not.
There comes a time that on page number 22, there is something weak, or there is a chance to do so. There is no time for micro editing, or what kind of steps you can take?
I would normally I would only agree to commission something if I trust the team, and I expect the writer, because we call it the creative triangle. I expect that the producer, director, and screenwriter will work with the material all the way. But if I've given them the responsibility from day one to make, for them to fix what's not working, then I also can trust that they keep doing that all the way. It's not always the case. And especially with these bigger companies that have sort of a big demand on making profits, they sometimes cut corners, and that makes me angry, of course, afterwards. But in general, it's very tempting to say that if you move that scene there and so forth, it's going to work out. But, then things happen when they're shooting. You still have to change things. This dialogue doesn't work. The actor can't say it. We have to rewrite it on. So I rather have a team that can do those things on their own. So for us, it's more like, the third episode is not, it doesn't feel dynamic enough, and you have to work on it. And we ask them to come with suggestions.
This kind of remark.
Yeah.
Like try improve certain parts.
Yeah. And then, because we have development executives, they develop until we are happy with the first two scripts and the storyline. And at that stage, we usually greenlight our participation. Then it goes over to the EPs, who then work with the production company until the production starts and during the production. And they have other skills, but they are also different. Some of them have a bigger tendency of going into details, but I'm trying to teach them not to do that, because it takes too much time. To write 15 pages of notes, it takes a long time, and I'd rather have them do other things.
So Camilla is gesturing to me that our time is up. So
There's another program. It's really
Sure.
good.
Okay. So thank you everybody for sharing your ideas. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.